Okay, cool. So greetings, everybody. We're recording this now. I imagine some other people will come in. The way we're gonna kind of set this up is I'll do a quick introduction for Dr. Lave, and then we will. She has prepared a presentation for about 40 minutes or so, and then we will have some discussion afterwards, and feel free to put questions in the chat. I will. I also have some questions on my own, and we'll kind of go from there. So we should be done about 4:30 Eastern time. So if you're checking the clock, and actually greetings to the many people who will watch this after the fact. This is going to go up on the Pulse MES YouTube channel and will be shared with a couple of scholarly networks. I know it's the middle of the day and it's a beautiful day here. It's like the nicest day we've had in probably 6 months. So we're going to talk about some fun stuff, and many people will access this later. But quick introduction, my name is Joe Henderson. I'm a faculty member here in Environment and Society. I'm one of the kind of environmental social science people on campus. I teach the sociology, anthropology. I teach a whole class on video game culture, which is super fun. So I have known Dr. Lave's work for, I don't know, almost 10 years now. I first encountered it in grad school when I was doing my PhD on the relationship between sustainability education and sustainability and kind of neoliberalism, which is the kind of modern form of capitalism, which we'll get into. And I first encountered a really interesting paper that I still love on what's the title? Neoliberalism and the Production of Environmental Knowledge. And that paper, Rebecca, was super useful for me when I was doing my dissertation. So thank you for that. Rebecca has well, I'll just get into kind of your background, and then we'll talk a little bit about your some of your works, and then you're kind of culminating with your book, which you're going to talk about now. But so Dr. Rebecca Lave, professor of geography at Indiana University. She's the chair of the geography department. Rebecca, we have a very small geography footprint here, GIS minor, a couple of classes in geography. Definitely an area that we could grow out, especially the kind of human geography aspect of it. PhD from UC Berkeley, works specifically in some really interesting scholarly fields. We have some overlap here: critical physical geography, stream restoration, which I know there are a lot of people here on campus who are interested in ecological restoration, historical landscape and hydroscape change, which as a former geology major, I appreciate that language. Political economy, which many of my classes have been talking about this semester. Political ecology, which many of my classes have also been talking about. And then a really huge field, science and technology studies. STS is a broad, interesting field that deals with all sorts of things. Rebecca teaches classes in human environment interaction, capitalism and nature, political ecology, has many publications that you should look up on her Google Scholar page. Interestingly, Google Scholar is now making publicly available research available to everybody. So if things are funded by public grants, you can now access them for free on Google Scholar, which is awesome. And so that's where I spend a lot of time. Rebecca, there's a couple of articles that I wanted to just highlight, and one of them, I followed your work very closely after the 2016 election because you, like me, I spent days after that election I work on climate change and climate change education, and I spent days downloading data sets, downloading documents, knowing that because of the political nature of climate change work, that much of that data was going to get erased and censored or canceled, if you want to use the language for today. And you were involved in an effort to kind of preserve a lot of that data for the public good. And so thank you for that. And I think, I don't know how much you want to talk about that, but it's, that was really important work for environmental science. And so thank you for that. Also, a paper that I found super interesting because I'm involved in some like eco-feminist work in some of my professional organizations. You were a co-author on a paper in, I believe, human geography. And the title of the paper, and it's a super important paper, is It's Time to Recognize How Men's Careers Benefit from Sexually Harassing Women in Academia. That paper there's a lot to chew on in that paper. That paper was shared widely among a lot of the even non-geography networks that I was in. So a lot of people in environmental education, where there's a lot of feminist scholarship going on, discussed and studied that paper, and it's been influential in that field as well. So she's co-author of a number of books, one in 2012 called Fields and Streams, Stream Restoration, Neoliberalism, and the Future of Environmental Science. And the one that I have not read yet and am really interested in hearing about, because I know it's the kind of conversations that Malusky and I have been having for a long, long time. Streams of revenue, the restoration economy, and the ecosystems it creates. So I will, while you're talking, I will put many of these links into the chat for people, and the floor is yours.
Super, thank you so much for that lovely and very detailed introduction. You know, usually I'm unused to someone pulling in so many different strands of the things I've done. So thank you, that was fun to hear, and fun to think about. Like, woo, crazy stuff. So it is my great pleasure to be with you all today. Those of you that are here, thank you so much for spending time inside on what sounds like a gorgeous afternoon. And, you know, I wish I could be with you in person, in part because that enables me to read the room and know when people are confused or concerned about something. So let me just say that I very much encourage you to jump in with questions if you have them as I go. I would very much welcome that. And we'll see how this runs. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. Let me, whoops. Let's get this to where it needs to be. That did not work very well. All right, this is not an omen. This is a glitch. It will be better in one moment. From beginning. All right, trying again. This is my life on Zoom. I just feel like there's so much more friction to all of the things that we used to do. All right, can people see that title slide now? Super, all right. So let's go ahead and start. So I want to just quickly, this image right here encapsulates a big piece of what I wanted to talk about. So this is a stream that was recently restored. You can see this upper version, this upper part of the stream near the top of the screen is what it used to look like. It had been straightened, and then it was restored into this very even regular channel. So this is part of what I will be addressing today. So ecological restoration, and I know many of you study this, so I will be brief about this. It's typically understood to bring back one or more of a couple of different things. So in some people's eyes, it's restoring ecological structure and function. Other people think about bringing it back kind of the wildness of nature and the self-determination of nature. And other folks think about it more in terms of ecosystem services. So the kinds of services that nature provides us for free, bringing back those kinds of things. But lately, restoration projects look a little different, okay? So instead of a stream like this or a river like this, where you see a whole lot of complexity and variation and irregularity, we're starting to see things like this. And the stream is right down the middle. You might have mistaken it for something else, right? But that very, very even, regular sine wave curve. Thinking more from a forestry point of view, instead of seeing forests that have a mix of trees and different canopy heights and all kinds of different things going on, we're starting to see more of things like this, these very even plantation-based forests that are deemed as restoration. This is not a commercial timber plantation. Okay. So what's going on here? Why are we seeing this switch into these more kind of formal, regularized forms of restoration? What's going on? So what I'm going to argue is that we're looking at the impact of markets, more specifically regulatory markets, and most specifically markets for ecosystem services. And if these terms aren't familiar with you, don't worry about it. I'm going to be explaining them. Right. So the rationale for these forms, new forms of market-based, or you may have heard the word neoliberal environmental management, is so the argument that advocates make is that our existing regulatory system, which is often referred to as command and control, and says thou shalt not harm, okay, that has failed. And that instead of preventing harm to the environment, what we need to do instead is put a price tag on it, okay, so that we allow environmental damage to take place, but offset it via restoration of an equivalent ecosystem somewhere else. So instead of the traditional goal of, for example, the Endangered Species Act, which is to prevent loss, the goal becomes to prevent net loss. Okay, so to prevent loss in the margin, but you can lose some things as long as you put something else back. Okay. So an example of this, which is the focus of my book, and I will talk a little bit more about it as we go, is the idea of stream mitigation banking. So under the US Clean Water Act, Section 404 is about preventing physical harm to aquatic resources of the US. But instead of preventing harm, how mitigation banking works is that it requires anybody that's going to damage a stream to purchase stream credits to offset the damage. And these credits in turn are produced almost always in the US by for-profit mitigation companies who go out and speculatively acquire rights to land with damaged streams on it and restore that, and then sell those credits to developers, public work departments, anybody that's gonna damage a stream, okay? So a market for ecosystem services is effectively a commodity market, but it's not a commodity market for the kinds of commodities we're used to thinking about, right? It's not a commodity market for gallons of oil or ounces of gold or tons of wheat. It's a commodity market for ecosystem services, all right? So here's an example for you. Imagine for a moment that you have 40 acres of land that you want to develop into a shopping mall or a housing development. And there are multiple inconveniently located streams on this property that are getting in the way of where you want parking lots or buildings or other things to go. So what really would be ideal for you as a developer would be to put them in pipes. Get them out of the way, off the surface, so you can build what you want, which is ecologically absolutely terrible for these streams. A command and control approach to regulation would say, no way, you may not cause that harm. A market-based approach says, yes, you may do that as long as you pay to restore equivalent streams somewhere else. Okay. So the way this works, so this idea of selling nature to save it is today really widespread in international environmental policy. So we have markets for ecosystem services around a lot of different things, from endangered species to water quality to carbon sequestration on every continent except Antarctica. And there is a whole lot of debate around this, but there's very little evidence about what it actually does, right? So the argument that proponents of market-based approaches are making is that the existing approach to conservation that we've done for decades in the US, this command and control, thou shalt not harm approach, has only gotten us so far. But that we haven't kind of gotten the West of the way. We're still hemorrhaging biodiversity. We're still losing resources at this very rapid rate. So what they're arguing is that if we're gonna kick that up, if we're gonna really put environmental conservation into high gear, we need to use markets. And the question is it working? So what I'm gonna do in this talk is first talk about what drove this shift from preventing harm to pricing it. Then I want to talk about what a market for ecosystem, sorry, let me try that sentence again. What a market for ecosystem services is and how it works. And then I want to talk about this question, which for me is the most important, of does this improve our ability to prevent harm, right? Is this kicking us up into another level of environmental protection or not? And then last, I want to conclude with a few comments about what this implies for the future of environmental markets. All right, and I want to stop quickly and just see if there are any questions. I can't see if any questions are coming up. Is there anything that I should deal with before moving on, Joe?
I don't see any yet. I'll let you know. I'll send a message to panelists if you see it.
Fantastic. Okay, so this move from preventing harm to pricing it, how does this work? So the idea of using markets to protect the environment, of selling nature in order to save it, you can trace the roots of that back into the 1950s and 60s, but it really gets going in international policy in the late 1990s. And I want to argue today that has three main intellectual roots. So the first one, which may surprise you, comes from ecology. So those of you that know your ecology history, the Odom brothers in the late 1960s were thinking about this. I mean, these are like giants of ecology in the US, and many other very influential ecologists in the late 60s and early 70s were wrestling with this problem of this curve, of conservation really not kicking up in the way that we wanted it to. And their argument was, what they felt was that the arguments they'd been making about the intrinsic value of nature, that we should conserve nature because of its inherent value, they felt that they had not won enough converts to the cause of conservation, and that instead, to build support for conservation in the US, that we needed to rely on the lingua franca of the 20th century, which is money. Okay, so monetary value. So they argued that what we needed to do was put a price tag on all of the services that nature provides us that we don't pay for. So this is everything from pollination of crops provided by bees to water quality improvement and flood regulation provided by wetlands. Okay, so they wanted to put a price tag on all this, but they didn't want us to actually sell it. They were not proposing a market. They were just trying to think about linguistically about a different way to explain the value of nature. All right. So this starts to meet up in the 70s and 80s with work in environmental and ecological economics. So again, they're also trying to argue that protecting nature by walling it off from the worst of capitalism's excesses. And you can think about things like national parks, wilderness refuges, state parks. These are ways in which we've tried in the past to protect nature from capitalism by basically fortress conservation. Okay, they're saying ecological economics, economists were saying that didn't work. Instead, rather than separating nature from capitalism, in order to protect it, we need to integrate it within capitalism. Okay? So they wanted to be able to put a price tag on it, which they hoped ecologists would take care of for them, but they did want to sell it. Okay, that was the goal, was to create a functioning market for the kinds of things that we've never thought about, had not previously thought about selling in this country. So various measures of environmental quality and ecosystem services. So these two ideas are floating out there and kind of coming together. And then what they hit starting in the late 1970s, the very end of the Carter administration, which may surprise some of you. Most of us think of it starting in Reagan, but it actually starts in 1979 with Carter, starts meeting up with this neoliberal governance framework, which wants to reduce regulatory burden, increase the efficiency and flexibility of regulation, right? This should sound very familiar to you. This debate is absolutely still going. Okay? But when these three things coalesce, what we get is a policy framework that starts with amendments to the Clean Air Act that are about selling rather than preventing environmental harm. So the theory here is that these new financial incentives, by pricing various environmental goods and harms, that this new financial incentives will support preservation of existing good quality resources by making them very expensive to damage, that it will increase restoration as people are forced to do things to offset the damage that they're now allowed to do, that it will stop our hemorrhaging loss of environmental resources in this country, and that it might even allow us to gain some new ones, and that it will increase regulatory efficiency and effectiveness. Okay, so question is, does it do that, right? And we'll get there in a minute, but first I want to tell you more about how this works in practice. Okay, so first and most critical distinction to hang on to here is the difference between a free market and a regulatory market. And I promised you at the beginning that I was going to explain this, so here's where I explain it. So in a free market, you get to, the idea is that both buyers and sellers are in the market of their own volition, of their own free will. Okay. There's a variety of goods and services for sale, and there is competition and thus innovation. So I like to think about this in terms of bread, especially after a pandemic in which many people stayed home and baked bread. It's been on my mind. So when you want to buy a loaf of bread, when we're all out and about and at bakeries, there are lots of choices, right? You could buy rye, you could buy sourdough, you could get a loaf of nicely squared off sandwich bread that's sliced in your grocery store. Many, many options. So you choose among them. Bakers are choosing to sell them. It's not like the government is making the bakers sell you bread. There's competition and change, innovation, right? And so the bread market shifts over time. In a regulatory market, no one is there because they want to be. Okay, they are there because they have to be. So buyers are required to purchase a particular form of regulatory compliance. What that form is determined by regulators. So the only variation is going to be on price, and there's no competition because everybody's buying the exact same thing. And I will illustrate this with an example. So I believe that New York State has auto emissions testing for licensing cars. So presumably this is something you are fairly familiar with. Okay, so this is a market, you know, maybe some of us would want to be in for environmental reasons, but the main reason most people are getting their cars emissions tested is because the state requires them to. Okay, so the way this works is that the emissions test should be the same wherever you go, so that the only reason you might choose to get this emission test as opposed to that emission test is maybe because it's closer to your house or where you work, or it's less expensive, but there's not any meaningful difference between them. Okay? That's a great example of a regulatory market. So for auto emissions testing, people are pretty comfortable with the idea that an auto emissions test here is the same as an auto emissions test here. But when you start getting into ecosystem services, it gets a whole lot messier, right? I wonder how many of you would be willing to say that a wetland over here in the Adirondacks is the same as a wetland in my area in Indiana. Probably very few of you, maybe even none of you, right? This gets far less straightforward, trying to figure out how you create these regulatory markets for ecosystem services. And there's been a lot of pushback. So why is it hard to create a really robust market for ecosystem services? There are a whole lot of challenges. There's an extensive literature on that, which I'm not going to talk about, but I will just let you know that there is a lot of stuff out there if you want to look. And some very common concerns are, for example, like, do regulators actually have the knowledge, the time, the budget to run these new markets? Okay, so is there regulatory capacity to actually take care of them? I was just hearing from Joe before the talk began that you all are suffering in the Adirondacks Park from lack of funding for rangers and other services, right? Is there a capacity to support this? One. Two, the idea of durability, right? If we're saying, okay, I can give up this wetland and let it be bulldozed as long as this other wetland is restored, will that wetland that was restored still be sticking around? That's got to matter, right? It needs to be around for the long term, or this was a really bad trade. Questions of social equity. If there is a small area of woods or a stream in your neighborhood, and the government allows that to be paved as long as the developer puts in a stream 45 miles away, that's not so helpful when you want to walk your dog. Yeah. Okay. So there's social equity questions about where resources are destroyed and where they're restored. There's also questions of time lag, right? If you're a frog and your pond that you live in is filled in, there better be somewhere else for you to go immediately, right? If the new pond is restored a year later, you're kind of out of luck. Yeah. So those are some of the many, many complaints or concerns that people have raised about these markets. Martin Doyle and I, my co-author on this book, Martin Doyle and I have argued that there are two challenges that trump all of those. Okay. One of them is this question of equivalence between the resource that's damaged and the resource that is restored. And the other thing is addressing the uncertainty of restoration in order to create a stable commodity for sale. And I'm going to talk about each of those two things. So the first thing, equivalence. The core rationale of any market for ecosystem service is that if you damage one thing, you can restore an equivalent somewhere else. Okay. So if you get in the way of equivalence, if you start to say there isn't equivalence, there is no rationale for any market for ecosystem services. It is difficult for me to overstate how important equivalence is. Okay. But I know there are lots of folks at Paul Smith who are involved in conservation, landscape management kinds of things, environmental science, right? I suspect it will not surprise you to hear that you can't exactly replicate an ecosystem over here that you lose over here with one over here, right? Ecosystems are incredibly specific to the places where they are located. They are dynamic, they are messy, they are interconnected, right? So you cannot insist on exact equivalence. Okay, if you do that, the whole show with markets for ecosystem services is just over. Okay? Instead, you have to think about some uncomfortable trade-offs. Okay, so if you say, okay, there's a stream here that we're going to put in a pipe and a stream here that we're going to restore, and we say the only thing that the restored stream has to have in common with the stream that's going in a pipe is the basics of its physical form. Okay, so you take something that's very narrow form of equivalence, a very limited form of equivalence. That is much easier to achieve, and therefore will create a stronger market. Okay? But if you say, no, the stream, in addition to physical form, has to have similar chemical and biological function, okay, that's a broader equivalence, but it makes it much less certain. And I see that on my slides, I have flipped more plausible versus less plausible, for which I apologize. So a narrow equivalence is less plausible ecologically, right? It's harder and harder to believe that a stream that only replicates the form of the stream that's damaged, that stream is a credible replacement. Okay, the broader the definition, the more ecologically credible it is, but the harder it is to do, which makes for a weaker market. I want to stop and see if there are questions.
I don't see any yet, but so I just to clarify, because I'm still processing this, right? You're saying that like basically a one-to-one comparison of ecosystems is almost impossible, and you have to do, there's all sorts of kind of trade-offs that need to be made while treating this as an economic good.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So I'm pretty comfortable with the idea that we can replicate an emissions test.
Right.
But replicating an ecosystem is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, for sure. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. All right, onwards. So the other big thing is this question of uncertainty, and this is something that is maybe less obvious, but also really important. So we expect commodities to be stable and consistent. Okay, so if you go to the grocery store to buy milk and you buy the same brand every time, and sometimes when you get it home, it's milk, and sometimes when you get it home, what's inside is orange juice, and sometimes what's inside is fizzy water, either you're going to stop buying that brand, or you're going to have to be very, very comfortable with chaos in your life, right? And very, very unpredictable breakfast cereal moments, okay? So what we're used to is that when we buy a product, if we buy the same product, we get the same thing. That is one of those fundamental assumptions underlying, for example, any online buying. Yeah? But that stability, that certainty is very difficult to produce in relation to markets for ecosystem services, or in fact, any market. Because the commodities we buy now are stable, it's really easy to take for granted that they've always been that way. One of the things I totally recommend reading is the chapter on how wheat got standardized from William Cronin's book, Nature's Metropolis. It's an environmental history of Chicago. It's a great book. But he has this one fabulous chapter about how we get to the current system of wheat classification, with like number 2 spring wheat, how we get from like the very particular one farmer's grain being sold to the system of classification and standardization such that, wheat becomes this very stable commodity. Really interesting read. All right, so it's difficult to make anything into a commodity. Markets for ecosystem services are certainly no exception to that. So there's a whole bunch of sources of uncertainty, okay? First of all, and it is possible that you all won't agree with me on this, but as someone who studies stream restoration, I think it's really unclear that we can successfully restore streams. Okay, it's a very complex process. I think we have grips on some parts of it and not others. So can we successfully restore the ecosystem in the first place? Okay, so this is the restored ecosystem we're talking about here, the compensation site. What if it gets wiped out by some kind of natural hazard, right? For a forest, what if it gets burned down in a forest fire or blown over in a hurricane? Okay. What if someone goes ahead and develops the site anyway, even though it's supposed to be protected? And what if this whole market falls apart and I'm left with all this work I've done to create a commodity that there's no longer buyers for? Okay, so there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. The way that this gets addressed, and remember, this is a regulatory market, so it's regulators that are running it. They have to figure out how to produce both a robust market and one that has at least some ecological credibility. So how they handle this is via the definition of the credit for sale, the commodity that's for sale in this market, and then the success criteria that are around it. You may know that as performance standards, right? The things that people that provide compensation are required to do in order to have credits for sale. So I want to give you 3 examples of markets, credit markets for ecosystem services in the US, and I will just speak about each of them very briefly. So first, stream mitigation banking. So as I mentioned, this is a regulatory market for compliance with the US Clean Water Act. And you may or may not know that the US Clean Water Act says that the goal is to protect biological, chemical, and physical integrity. Okay. So stream credits, what's for sale in the mitigation banking market, are defined in different ways in different Army Corps districts, but the basics are that they are defined by the extent of the intervention. So if you simply put up fencing to keep cattle out of the stream, you get many, many fewer credits to sell than if you get out the big yellow construction equipment and completely reconfigure the stream. Okay? So it privileges intense intervention. Credits are defined by the linear foot of channel of a particular physical form. And as part of the performance standards of success criteria around this, the recreated channel has to stay stable for, depending on the state you're in, 3 to 7 years. Okay? And these reconfigured channels, the physical form of the channel becomes a proxy for the chemical and biological health that the Clean Water Act also emphasizes. Okay, so the Clean Water Act says biological, chemical, and physical integrity, but stream mitigation focused just on the physical as a proxy. All right, so why channel stability? Why would this happen? Boy, I could talk about this for hours, so I'm going to be very, very brief here. Imagine my arm as a drainage network. Not a great drainage network, but it kind of works, okay? So imagine that you do the best stream restoration project in the world right here, and then some idiot up here dumps chlorine in the water, okay? All the good stuff you did would be wiped out. Okay? So there's a sense in which chemistry, water chemistry and biology are just too out of the control of the owner of the site where the restoration takes place. Okay? But unlike most stream attributes, the physical form of the channel, stability of form, is actually fairly easy to control. So that's where they focus. So that's a very narrow equivalence. Okay, so here is the stream that's getting bulldozed and put in a pipe. Here's the stream that's being restored. The one thing that they have to have in common is their physical form. And it's not even like, let me just say that differently. It's not even that this one copies the physical form of this one. It's that this one has to have a physical form that's considered healthy and stable that may look nothing like what was over here. So this is a very narrow equivalence, but because it's very narrow and therefore it is easy to achieve, it's made for a very stable commodity and a very robust market. The market for stream credits in the US is thriving. Okay. Another example that may be familiar to some of you is the idea of conservation or habitat banking. So this is a regulatory market for compliance with the Endangered Species Act. So credit, this one is kind of interesting to me because the credits were initially defined very, very broadly, and then they were narrowed to meet market needs. And a great example of this that you can see in 2 journal articles. Short one is with vernal pools. Okay, so these are the wetlands that come up just seasonally in the spring. So the way this market was initially defined was a very broad equivalence. Okay, if you wanted to destroy a vernal pool and restore another one, you had to think about what kind of vernal pool it was, what was the land uses in the surrounding areas, what specific species were using that pool, right? All of these things. The checklist for it was like 3 pages long, and you had to be able to replicate all of them. Okay. That was really, really hard. So what happened is that the market never took off. People weren't willing to provide the credits. They weren't willing to do that work because it was just too uncertain. Okay, so within 10 years, and I'm not sure when exactly within that 10 years this happened, they dropped from this 3-page complex, ecologically plausible checklist down to acres of habitat. That was the measure. Doesn't matter what kind of vernal pool, doesn't matter what kind of shape it is, it's the acres. So it's just the size. Okay, which is, depending on how you feel about this, fairly depressing. What makes it less depressing to me is that they often went for preservation of an existing vernal pool rather than trying to create a new one. But that means that for sure there's net loss, right? Because we're losing one site and all we're doing is making sure the second site doesn't get bulldozed. We're not creating or restoring any new stuff. Okay. Another example I would give to you, just so you understand how this works, the red cockaded woodpecker. Okay, so here we have an endangered species. So you would think that the market, the credit for this would be defined in terms of breeding pairs, because that's what matters for the preservation of the species, right? No, turns out that that is uncertain, and it's hard to measure whether you have breeding pairs, and it's hard for the person who's trying to produce the credit to ensure that they have breeding pairs in the area that they've set aside. So instead, it's just area of habitat that we think red cockaded woodpeckers might like. Okay, so does this actually deal with endangered species? We don't know. We know it provides habitat that they might like, but we have no idea. Okay. So as with stream mitigation banking, this very narrow definition of the credit, this very narrow equivalence, leads to a highly stable commodity and a very robust market for habitat banking. Contrast this with a market that may be familiar to some of you from reading about it in newspapers, which is carbon markets. Okay, so this is compliance with the clean development mechanism. And initially in this process, afforestation or reforestation was considered too uncertain to be part of this. But eventually these get adopted into the clean development mechanism with exactingly detailed credit definitions, success criteria. I mean, like, it's like this, the things you have to read through to be able just to document additionality, for example, like so it's like really, really detailed regulations. There was really careful attention to the uncertain outcome of restoration by making the credits temporary. Okay. So you have all of this incredible attention to broad equivalence. You have this attention to uncertainty. It's really, really scientifically credible, but the market has been very weak. This broadly defined equivalence created a high level of uncertainty about the stability of the commodity for sale, these carbon credits, and whether or not people could actually produce them. And it scared away both potential credit producers and potential credit buyers. I do think this is starting to shift, and some of you may know more about how that's starting to shift than I do, but the complexity really hamstrung this market. All right. So let me just go back and just say quickly. So you have these two very different visions, right? You have a very, let me see if I can use this with my hands. You have a very complete, very broad equivalence with a market that just doesn't work, or you have this very narrow, very small equivalence, and that is predictable and stable enough for a market to function, but is pretty depressing from an ecological standpoint. All right. So here's the $1 million question, or whatever. I don't know what unit of cash to use these days with all the numbers that are getting tossed around in the world, but we'll just stick with $1 million for a moment. Here's the $1 million question. What do these things actually do, right? Does this actually kick conservation up to another level or not? So unfortunately, there are lots of claims and less evidence. So folks that are big advocates for these programs and economists describe them as triumphant successes. Critical social scientists have more of a split view on this. So some think, well, you know, nature can't get pushed around by markets very much. So, you know, we can try, but it's not really going to do any harm. You know, this is sort of the nature bats last perspective. Other folks would argue that anything market-based must be bad based on what's happened when we've marketized schooling and healthcare and things like that. So they argue that this is a disaster. Biophysical scientists, a lot of crickets here, a lot of silence. Okay, so my favorite demonstration of this is a paper from just 2 years ago that looked at 16,000 articles plus on no net loss and discovered only 32 that even tried to evaluate the impacts of these kinds of programs. Okay, so we don't have a lot of data on this. Why not? Well, you know, economists and critical social scientists generally don't have the training to do the kind of work that's needed. And if that work were easy, maybe we wouldn't have these things by proxy in the first place, right? Part of why the encouragement to do these very narrow equivalences is that that is easy to measure. When you start trying to look at broad consequences, it's complicated, it's expensive, and people who don't have training can't do it. Okay. On the flip side, it can often be difficult to interest biophysical scientists in studying degraded ecosystems, right? There's an evident and sort of a focus classically on trying to look at less degraded ecosystems to understand how they work absent human intervention. So trying to focus on ecosystem, getting physical scientists to focus on ecosystems that have been explicitly tampered with and messed with can be hard. But what can we say? Like, what do we know? Well, in stream mitigation banking, and here I'm drawing on evidence from a lot of different folks, but also from Martin's in my book. And I really, this pains me to say, there is no evidence of biological or chemical improvement from these projects. And I put the word lift in here. That's the word that gets used in Clean Water Act related discussions. Okay, so maybe we can say, well, you know, many of these projects are only 10, 15 years old. Some of them are younger, like a lot of them are younger than that. Maybe if we just give them more time, maybe. Yep. So I'm not trying to say that these projects will have no benefits ever. I'm trying to say they don't have benefits now. Okay, and they don't have benefits for a while. So that seems problematic. And you know, there are some fast explanations for that, in that the emphasis on channel stability is at odds with the dynamism of streams, right? If any of you have ever spent time thinking about streams, one of their defining characteristics is they move, right? They meander, they erode, they do things. The idea that we're nailing them in place changes the habitat that's available. It changes all sorts of things. So stream mitigation banking, is it kicking it up? No. Conservation habitat banking. So remember my discussion of the red cockaded woodpecker and then the vernal pools? credits are based on proxies for endangered species survival. So what that means is maybe they're effective, maybe they're not. We don't know. Okay. The preservation, the emphasis on preservation definitely to me seems more promising than restoration, even though restoration is what I love and think about all the time. And that's what gets me up in the morning is the promise of restoration. But preserving habitat that's already good, I have more faith in, but it ensures net loss, which is scary. Carbon sequestration, as far as we know, things like that carbon plantation I showed you early on in the presentation, that is an effective carbon sink. But it doesn't have a lot of what might be described as secondary benefits, right? It doesn't have an understory. It doesn't have kinds of things that support lots of different organisms, okay? And that's because it's not included in the credit definitions. We have these exacting definitions of how you're going to do the carbon sequestration, but it doesn't really deal with the ecology of forests or the kinds of relations we would care about there. So I would argue that overall, markets for ecosystem services in their current form are not very promising. Okay, they are clearly not replacing the complexity and the richness of ecosystems that we allow to be destroyed under this market-based model. They are delivering what regulators ask for, but only that. What we ask them to do is all that we get, which is problematic, I would argue. So what does this mean for the future? And thank you all for hanging in there. I am nearly done. All right. So this is clearly not what advocates for markets, these market-based approaches have in mind. One of the things that I would really like to emphasize is the good intentions of everyone involved in these markets. Okay, I have been working with folks who work on these markets for 15 years, and I can tell you that in all that time, I have met 2 people who, I think, actually really don't care about streams very much. Okay, everybody wants this to work. So please be clear that there are no, this isn't a system, that the problem here is not bad actors. Okay, so this is not what they had in mind. It is restoring only the characteristics that are actually captured in the credit definitions or success criteria. It's creating ecosystems that I would argue have just not the kinds of conservation benefits we're hoping for. And for people that were really strong free market advocates, right, a regulatory market is really not a free market. So what do we do? I think there are a couple of big pathways. So one is to give up on this market-based approach and say, no more pricing harm. We're going to go back to saying, thou shalt not. Okay. This is an argument made by people who say, look, we have really good environmental laws. We just need to enforce them. Okay. I think, though, that since these market-based approaches are in place, we need to think about how to fix them, because I don't think they're going away soon. I guess I myself prefer the going back and trying to prevent, to our former approach and trying to prevent harm and actually enforcing the laws we have. I think that it is not plausible that we're going to get there yet. So then the question is, what could we do to fix these markets now? And Martin Doyle and I should have said at the beginning of this talk, this is based on a project that we started in 2006. And we have been working on this and thinking about it for a very long time. And so what we ended up coming to, and this is distilling a lot of thought and angst and research and discussion, we've come down to, we think there are 2 paths forward that are plausible to us. One of them is to further narrow the equivalence, and the other one is to just go wild and embrace uncertainty. So what might that look like? The goal of restoring equivalence would say, of sort of narrowing equivalence further would say, look, instead of saying that we want markets for ecosystem services to replicate whole systems, that we want this new stream to look like this old stream and be an equivalent to this, we're going to give that up. And instead, what we're going to do is embrace what we do well, which is control and artificiality. And we're going to say, all right, this stream over here that gets put in a pipe, the only thing we need this new stream to do is to reduce nutrient loads or protect an endangered species. Okay, so for nutrient loads, for example, we can design these riffles. For those of you that don't know what I mean, we can design these parts of a stream where there are lots of rocks and the water moves faster, and therefore kind of there's more oxygenation, a lot of things going on. We can design artificial riffles. We can design rubber-lined streams that take them down underground into the hyporeic zone, where they get more the kind of interaction that removes nutrients from the water. It won't look anything like a stream in the sense that we're used to it. Like, no one will look at it and think, oh, there's a natural stream, but we'll get rid of the nutrients. right? We'll get rid of the nitrate. Or if you're thinking about, we want salmon to survive, we'll just toss in hatchery fish. Like, we're not going to worry about the habitat for them. We're not going to make anything better for them, but we can toss in hatchery fish and have fish there every year. Okay. It's low risk and it's low reward, but at least we know we get some reward, which from the current system, maybe, maybe not. Okay. The other way to go, which I will confess probably suits my personality better, but not necessarily Martin's, is to like relinquish control. Try to enable these messy dynamic landscape processes. Like, the goal is to get out of the way and have this maximal self-determination for the system. And so these are things you might already have heard about in different contexts. The idea of self-forming channels, right? Where we just like carve, like just put one big channel through the middle of the landscape, get out of the way, let it develop. Or the idea of rewilding, right? I don't know how much you've heard about that, but the idea of like turning the whole Great Plains, right, back over to surrogates for the megafauna that lived there before, right? These are chaotic, they are messy, we don't know if they're gonna work. They're high risk, but they could also be really high reward. So that's what Martin and I saw as these two ways going forward. And we see it as kind of a binary. Like, you can go one way or you can go the other, but this middle road that we're trying to do right now, to our minds, really doesn't work. Yeah. So we think that this holds not just for stream mitigation banking, which is what we've been studying all these years, but that any ecosystem service market will have this same tension between the dynamism and chaos and specificity of ecosystems and the needs of markets for these very stable, repeatable, homogenized commodities. And given that we are very unlikely to get something better than what we ask for, we really think it's time to try to think about this differently. So with that, thank you so much. And I will very much look forward to questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was I have so many questions, and I want Craig has asked a couple of really interesting questions in the Q&A, and I think you can see those. Hey, Jill, can you kick it back to the three of us, to Rebecca and Craig and I?
Oh yeah, and let me stop the screen share. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. So that should work. I think before we get to Craig is very much the specialist in ecological restoration and teaches the classes and oversees the major, and so I want to give him some space here, a considerable amount of space. But I'm just struck by the overlaps across domains of this. I'm a local school board member, and the Department of Education is talking about doing standardized testing this year. And just the way there's this persistent need to homogenize and make things legible I keep coming back to like James Scott's work, seeing like a state, right? Like, you can't, how can you regulate if you don't know what's out there, and you need data for that, right? So but also we see this across higher education around accreditation of programs. You see this through this phenomena. It's present in my wife's practices in medicine, the phenomena of standardization and making kind of markets legible in domains of life. And I just wonder about that. I'm with you on this one in terms of like, we're so enmeshed. I'm really glad that you said it's not like these people are nefarious actors, right? Like, people desperately care, like we care about educational quality and healthcare quality and ecosystem quality, but like, we're all kind of wrapped up in this logic of markets and privatization. And I don't really have a question. It's just interesting to me how dominant that thinking is in our lives, including this.
Yeah. And I mean, the one thing I'd say in response to that, like, first of all, I'd say yes, like, absolutely, it stuns me how pervasive this is. And then the other thing that I think about, and I would have a hard time figuring out how I would make this argument in relation to streams. I've never tried, so I would need to think about that. But in relation to higher education, which I've thought about a lot, I think there are some advantages or some silver linings. Like, I think the emphasis on metrics and accounting like what I see in my field is that it's opened up who gets hired, so that instead of people having this reputational capital of coming from a great program, we count the things they've done. And when you do that, you start to open the field to other people, which I find interesting. Or, you know, I think, well, so I guess I just say, I think there are some, I think we can find some silver linings and some openings for more progressive agendas within it, but it's certainly so pervasive.
I was wondering if can you see Craig's first question there?
Let me pull it up here. So this is the one about, and can everyone see this question?
I think just us.
Okay, shall I read it then? Or
Sure,
Craig, do you want to restate it?
Yeah, Craig, why don't you just unmute yourself and ask that question while she reads it?
Okay, let me see, make sure I'm on the first. I sent two questions. Okay. Yeah, I was, as I was listening to you, Rebecca, I was trying to type at the same time. So I'll see if I can clarify if it needs clarification along the way. It seems that the regulatory market is an offshoot or more clever form of the command and control pathology of natural resource management, which typically failed in the long run. For example, levees along large rivers and channelization of rivers and streams. I wonder if a deeper issue is an attachment to a worldview of a society that places a dollar value on everything, rather than a worldview that is less inclined to think in terms of ecosystem services, one that would take a more humble approach in the form of reverence for our environments and accepting them for as they are. And one of the things that sticks in my mind even to this day, many years ago, I had a farmer say to me, the land's got to pay for itself. And he was also actively draining wetlands. And so I just have to wonder if what's one of the drivers behind all this is just how we view our relationship to our environment.
Yeah, I mean, I so agree with you. I think that's one of the most fundamental issues that we face in thinking about the environment. And you know, I'm continually startled by how comfortable people are thinking about the environment in dollar terms. And so, you know, for a while I've been trying to think about, well, how could we explain this differently? What are the terms we could use to get people that would matter to people? And you know, one of the things I was trying recently in a class was I was talking about Hurricane Harvey and the damage from Hurricane Harvey. And we rank hurricanes by dollar value. We say what category they were, but then we say like, oh, like Hurricane Harvey, and I'm going to get these numbers wrong, please don't quote me, but you know, $16 billion in damage, right? And I said to them, all right, so how can we think about this differently? So we lost 168 people, I think it was, in Hurricane Harvey. That's abstract. So I was standing with my back to them because I was writing on the whiteboard, and I was like, okay, so what if we said we lost 168 high school sweethearts, arch enemies, grandmothers? And when I said grandmother, there was this audible gasp from the room, and I turned around, everybody was like, and I was like, oh, all right, so maybe we need to value things in grandparents or something, right? I mean, I'm being a little flippant here, but something, we need to find these ways that we connect to nature and these kinds of impacts, not, to me, I think, not through dollar values. And what are the language we use to do that, though, is really unclear to me, but I think it's so important.
Yeah, that's the tough part. And I did ask another question. Joe, did anybody else, am I seeing the only questions that were asked at this point?
It's a little hard, Craig, because you and I can see the Q&As and everybody else can see the chats, and we're having compete. So, and actually, Craig, I want to kind of bridge off your next question, but because it's actually related to some research that I'm doing right now. But Rebecca, in the chat, Bronwyn asked a really interesting question, which I think is about like the aesthetics of all of this. Like people have in their heads this kind of concept of what a stream should be or what a forest should be, and there's this kind of deeply cultural conditioning at work around your example of like just piping a stream underground so that it deals with the nutrient loads, and like it basically, it's not what you would consider a stream, but it's doing what it needs to do ecologically, if that's what we're going to value. Yeah, I mean, is part of the issue here like an aesthetic one?
Bronwyn, I really think you're onto something. So but I think the aesthetics plays in a couple different ways. So you may remember, or you may not, the picture that I showed you right at the beginning of the talk of that perfectly symmetrical sine wave stream. A lot of people like the aesthetics of that. And the same thing with the tree plantations, right? There's this regularity and order, and I notice, you may have noticed that you may remember that I said that we don't have lots of data about how some of these programs have come out. In the absence of that monitoring data, what we hear instead is aesthetics. So you'll see someone put up slides of the before and after of a restoration project and say, now just look at that. You can just see that the frogs and the insects are so much happier now, right? So there's a very aesthetic thing happening. And I agree with you that my example of the denitrification through these artificial rubber lined kind of riffles and things could be a tough sell, but I'm not sure we're getting much more out of these ones that do look natural to us. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I think it's a really important question to which I do not have a good answer, but I think it matters.
Yeah. One question that Craig asked is the kind of I'm gonna use a term here that some of my students will know, because I prattle on a lot about this, but the concept of hegemony, right? Like hegemonic thought within governing agencies. And I loved the conversation of Carter and neoliberalism. People are often shocked when you bring up Carter and then talk about how he's actually quite similar to Reagan in some ways. And then I guess like we saw that agency logic. This is what I'm working on right now, shift here in the Adirondack Park around the creation of the APA, which was really a kind of first of its kind governance agency. And it went from this kind of command and control model to this kind of more privatized model. Are there competing agency logics within the regulatory agencies, or is this kind of hegemonic? And like, where do you see that going, especially now that the Biden administration is going to start moving with some of these, is going to actually care about environmental regulation instead of using an agency to basically capture, like, to be captured by industry? Where do you see this going in terms of like federal, state, international? So I guess it's a two-part question. Are there competing logics within agencies? And then where does this go? Do we know? Do you have a sense of that?
So let's see. So there is some really interesting work on the kind of the ways in which agency staff are or are not internalizing this. So I'm thinking about like, there's one of Jessica Dempsey's papers that deals with this. I would need to think a little bit to remember exactly who all those are, because I'm remembering people's first names and not their last names, which is very unhelpful when you're trying to find a paper. But so there is work on that, on how this is affecting the subjectivities of environmental agency staff. Certainly what I saw is that there's a ton of skepticism about it, but there are also, there are, it's somewhat generational, because these days, if you go and get an environmental management master's degree at like, the Nicholas School at Duke or the Bren Center at UC Santa Barbara, or even the SPIA where I am at Indiana, which is one of the top programs for masters in environmental affairs, right? You're getting trained in this market logic. So right now, I would say that more agency staff are skeptical about it than are not, but I don't know how that will change over time. But the other thing that I think happens is that, and it's part of why Martin and I wrote this book, like our audience for this book, our dream audience is students who are in kind of advanced undergraduate courses or master's courses and who are training to go into natural resource management. Those are the people we were really trying to talk to with the book, because what will happen in their lives, I predict, and I'm pretty confident in this prediction, is that at some point they will get asked to help implement one of these markets. And then they will run into all of these messinesses and contradictions, and that stops people short, right? They may have been very supportive of it up to that point, and then when they see it in practice, they're like, whoa, wait a minute, this is not what I thought was going to happen. So my guess is that we will see, so right now there's sort of grudging support for these sort of market-based approaches. I think, right, we'll see it go up as people come in who've been trained to think that this is the way to go. And then I think we're going to see it go back down again. But you know, that and a $5 will get you a cup of coffee, right? So.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I would say the same thing when you just described all those programs. We have a master's degree in natural resource management. That is predominantly the logic that is used and discussed. And as one of the few social scientists, I'm always like, well, what do you mean by management? Like, whose ideology, what logic are you using? Are we talking about like indigenous land management, which would like what are we talking about? And like that question is never even asked. It's just ideology, right? It just functions at the level of like common sense, and I think that's really, really interesting. Tim asked a really interesting question about the like rewilding or the kind of going wild, and I don't know much about this, but there's been some talk in environmental ed circles around like ferility, like going back, like feral, kind of going. What do you make of that move? That seems like a radical move, and I don't mean that necessarily as a bad thing.
You know, I don't know what I think. I love thinking about it, but I don't think I've come to a conclusion yet. So, you know, there's part of me as a Midwestern resident that gets a little cranky about the fact that all of these environmentalists on the West Coast and the East Coast say, sure, we can just take the Great Plains, like there's nobody really there anyway, right? Like there are a lot of people there. And I think that they would have very mixed feelings about suddenly keeping company with a whole lot of predators. I mean, you know, I think the Bactrian camels and the gigantic tortoises and things people would be way more chill about. Like herbivores, people tend to be way more comfortable with for, you know, obvious reasons, because they don't eat us. So on the one hand, I think this is crazy. Like, why would we think that the bringing back megafauna that were last on this continent, you know, 11,000, 12,000 years ago, would be a good idea, because the environment has changed so much since then. The things that are here now mostly aren't adapted to having those things around. So I find the ecological argument for it a little tenuous, but I'm not an ecologist, so you know, it's not like I have the expertise. And there are other parts of me that just love it. Like I love, you know, the ferility idea, the idea of letting things go back into their own control, and having, you know, it would require like drawing humans more into enclaves, right? And letting more of the landscape outside it be alien to us, or aliens, maybe not the right word, but be separate from us. And there's some beauty to that, I think.
Yeah, that's it. That just brings up so many questions, and all I can think about is that the megafauna that used to like patrol what is now New York, we had this like giant 6-foot tall beaver. And
whoa.
Yeah.
People have a hard enough time with the short ones, you know?
Well,
like
and
there
also,
are a lot of people that don't like beaver.
What do you make? Craig and I talked about this quite a bit when we were, and for everybody who's still here, please ask questions in the Q&A while you know, we're asking our questions. What do you make restoration, like as a ideology, like, or as a discourse, kind of evokes almost a religious kind of discourse to me, and there's this kind of sense of like fallenness and sin, right? Like we have sinned and we need to restore and like be born again. There's this kind of born again, like what do you make of that? And what does that say about, I mean, because like the rewilding stuff seems like kind of going back to this persistent need to go back to this idyllic state, right? To like make it great again, if you want to use that kind of language. What do you, is restoration even the right way to think about this?
Yeah, you know, I don't know. I mean, it's easier for me not to fuss about this because what I work on is stream restoration, and basically no one is talking about turning back the clock with streams. Like no one says, oh, we're going to put stream back the way it was in 1800, because everybody knows that everything in the watershed has changed enough that there's no point in doing that. So there's much less of that kind of return to the Garden of Eden pressure in relation to stream restoration than I think there is in relation to almost any other kind of ecosystem. But I think this is one of those moments when climate change for me makes such a huge difference that the idea of turning back the clock just doesn't make sense. And so, yeah, I don't know that restoration is the right word. And there were huge fights about this in stream restoration, at least in the 90s, big fights about whether we should be saying enhancement or rehabilitation or restoration. And, I don't love those fights. I didn't find them particularly interesting, but I agree with you that I'm not sure restoration is the right word. I wonder what Craig thinks. I see that he has his hand up.
Yeah, and actually, Craig, I want to turn this over to you for a while, and other attendees who have questions. So go ahead.
I just find this whole topic very interesting. Just looking at the field of ecological restoration, it became a profession in the late 1980s, 1988, 89, and the whole field has undergone a transformation over time. Where originally it focused primarily on the ecological aspects of degraded ecosystems, and as time has gone on, it's looking at the social aspect of ecological restoration as well. And so you're starting to see more and more papers, not just about ecological resilience and ecological restoration, but how ecological restoration can be a form of enhancing or restoring or cultivating or restoring social resilience as well. And it seems like that's a big area of study. But what recently came out in 2019 is a document, let's see, what's it called here? It's called the International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration. And it's gone through, it's on its second edition now. And I believe one of the first principles it refers to is related to the social connection of humans to ecological restoration. So I think the field itself is developing in some pretty positive ways. And the Society of Ecological Restoration defines ecological restoration as assisting the recovery of damaged, degraded, or destroyed systems rather than trying to fix them. So it's just more or less like pulling off the stressors and let the system doing what it needs to do, and just assisting the recovery. And I was trying to think about, one of the things that seems to be a big challenge for any kind of environmental work is the fragmentations of streams and wetlands in our thought processes from the watershed and the landscape. And one of the things I just kind of find that jarring, and I talk to students about this, about surface water and subsurface water. We sometimes have it in our heads that these are two different entities when they're so connected. And these streams, for example, are basically signatures of the watershed. And I don't know, I have hopes. I came here from South Dakota, and I worked in Southeast Minnesota for a while, and worked in southern Minnesota where 90% of the wetlands were drained, and 95% in Iowa. I used to have these conversations with some of my friends out there about protection versus restoration. And as I said, well, there's not a whole lot of in terms of wetlands to protect in Iowa, but there certainly is a lot to restore. And so I think the whole field is making headway in terms of what it really means to restore. We're not going to a system arrives at a place through its own genesis over time, so it most certainly can't be totally replicated. And the bringing in the social cultural aspect into ecological restoration seems to be gaining speed as well. There's one last thing I wanted to mention about this that was sticking in my mind. I wish I could remember it right now.
Hey, Craig, while you try to think about that, I would like to know what Rebecca thinks of the sociocultural piece of this. I see similar things around the discourse around sustainability seems to be including that. Even the climate change discourse is really moving in that direction. Resilience, which is another fraught term that comes out in the 70s and twins with neoliberalism quite a bit. But it does seem like there seems to be movement. And Rebecca, you're in geography, and maybe you could just speak about, like, are you seeing that move as well across disciplines?
Definitely, and I think it's really positive. I think I will just say, like, I think we need, so bringing people back in is, to me, really fundamental, and thinking about about people's needs. And then I think the next step is differentiating among the people, right? That we're not just all the same unit. We don't all have the same resources. We don't all have the same involvement in causing harm in the first place, right? So a bunch of stuff along that line, I think is super important. Yeah, I feel like I see it playing out really strongly in debates over the Anthropocene, right? When should it start? And also, what should we call it, right? People who are calling it the capitalist scene and the plantationist scene and all these things, different ways of thinking about who the we involved in that are. But, Craig, the language that Craig was using made me think about, like, if we were going to do a different term instead of restoration, I was riffing off your idea of assistance, Craig, and thinking, maybe we need to be talking about it in like the language of mutual aid, or things along that, right? Like, we get so much from the environments around us, and it's, we need to give back. And so maybe it's that kind of framing that would work for people. I don't know.
Mutual aid is so interesting because that's often a kind of like radical political movement that is done in the absence of state failure. People go to mutual aid. We had mutual aid pop up here in our small town during the pandemic.
Here too.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's used. We have an academic program in disaster management, and where they talk about kind of mutual aid after disasters. I just have so many other questions. Craig, do you want to? Did you figure out your other question, or does anybody else want to ask any other questions?
I'll be real quick about it because I don't. If other people have a question, I just assume they ask. But
Craig, until they come in, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, one thing I have to totally agree with is, I worked for a couple of different state agencies at different times, and it was pretty clear to me there was indeed one group that did not really like this idea of no net loss, and other people immediately bought into it and thinking it was a good deal. And boy, oh boy, there is no real replacement of a natural wetland with a one that's created, for example. And it just certainly seems like this idea of no net loss and mitigation banking is just, from my perspective, I know others, was just kind of fraudulent in its approach to actually doing anything that was long term. No net loss is like a big compromise, and in some ways, in my opinion, anyways, a little bit of a lie. It seems like we should be thinking in terms of how about net gain, net recovery, whatever terms need to be used. So that was a thought I was going to share, and I was just wondering what you thought about, what you might think about that, Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment of when George H.W. Bush proposed no net loss, I mean, it was that would have been a big improvement over what was happening. And I think the way that we've implemented it hasn't lived up to that promise. And I am 100% with you on gain, right? Like, let's not stop at net loss. Like, I think there's such a strong argument for, and you can make it really utilitarian in terms of carbon sequestration and water filtration and flood attenuation and all the things wetlands do, right? You could make that utilitarian argument, or you could just say, like, wow, we've gotten rid of 90+% of them, depending on what state you're in.
Yeah.
That's crazy. So I think that, I'm speaking to you from Indiana, where we had the Grand Kankakee swamp, which was the biggest swamp in the lower 48 other than the Everglades, and is now down to like 3% of its historic extent, right? It's just crazy to me that we don't have to change that much around us in order to live and to live well.
Rebecca, I have, in the absence of other questions from anybody, and we have a couple more minutes here, but and there's been plenty of links shared in the chat, and I'm happy to share that out with everybody. I want to kind of switch gears to talk more about your professional practice, and I think one of the reasons I've been really drawn to your work over the years is that, like, my background, I have an undergrad degree in environmental geology, and then like went into training in like learning theory and the social sciences and anthropology and sociology, and I didn't find that there were a lot of people who were blending the kind of, the two cultures, the CP Snow, like the natural sciences and the social sciences. And I know that you've been a pretty passionate advocate about doing that. And geography as a field is, I mean, still quite split. The AAG conferences are really interesting to go to. I mean, you'll have like military GIS, like right next to like radical, like anarchist geographer booths. And
Yeah.
the first time I saw that, I was like, whoa. But I guess, can you just talk about the need to do this kind of like interdisciplinary work and like create programs for it and create and to think through that? We are starting, Craig has actually been really instrumental in a kind of environmental humanities program at our school. But we have a lot of interdisciplinary programs, but like what do you think about that, its importance? What is the kind of landscape of higher education as it comes to that?
Yeah. All right. So this is definitely my favorite hobby horse to ride.
I knew you liked it, so I just
Yes,
wanted to
I
tee you up
do.
there.
So I kind of did the reverse path from you. I did more kind of theory and kind of humanities and critical social science in college, and then kind of went more and more towards the physical science in grad school. But I think, in my opinion, if we're going to work on any kind of environmental issues that we face, the environmental issues we face are clearly a combination of biophysical and social drivers, right, is what cause them. If we are going to solve them, there is no way we can do that without arguments that bring together biophysical and social analyses, right? I mean, it just feels like such a no-brainer to me. And what I feel like what gets in the way of it is that our educational system is set up so that there are very, very few interdisciplinary tracks, right? You major in biology or you major in anthropology, but there isn't generally, a track that brings those two things together very well, unless you're talking more about like kind of, well, that's maybe a bad example because there is biological anthropology, but it's not, maybe a better way to talk about it would be like stream restoration, right? That there are people that study the ethics of stream restoration, and there are people that study how to do it, and those are almost never the same people. And that to me just feels like such a loss. I would argue that if you study any kind of environmental science, that you can no longer explain what is happening at your field site if you do not pull in both biophysical and social explanations, right? So to me, it's like the most important thing to do, but it's still pretty rare. Like geography, the reason why I became a geographer is that geography was the original interdiscipline, right? It's the one that started, from the get-go in the 1800s, putting together physical and social science. And so I showed up for my first day of my PhD program, and I met with my committee, and I said, all right, so what I want to do is work on the political economy of stream restoration. And I'm going to be taking classes in political economy and classes in hydrology and geomorphology. And they just looked at me and they said, no, you won't. You may not do that. And I was like, what? And they said, well, you can't possibly do that well. Yeah. Now, I will totally give to them that I may not do it that well, but I'm not going to stop trying. And I think, it's it doesn't have to be just one person doing everything, right? I think there's some people that can do that. It sounds like Craig is doing a brilliant job of pulling down like both the ecological restoration, biophysical part of it and the humanities part of it. Speaking for myself, I would say that I'm way stronger on the social science than I am on the physical science side. I know enough to be dangerous, but I don't know enough to really do it on my own. So I work with collaborators almost all the time, and I love it. So I don't think it has to be just one kind of Renaissance person, though I have tremendous admiration for those people that do that. But I also think collaboration is a really good way to go, and I think we need it.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I have like, just as I was in a school of education doing work around like environmental thought and political ideology, and no one knew what to do with me. They still don't know what to do with me. And it actually made like, I landed in an environmental studies department because those tend to be the places that are more interdisciplinary. Interestingly, we've been writing for like 5 or 6 years now, like dear educational systems, you need to start taking climate change seriously. And like now I'm starting to get invited to these things, but like good luck ever like doing it seems one of the things I really love about our school, our very small out of the way school kind of in the middle of the Adirondack Park, is like we don't do it perfectly, but we do have these kind of weird interdisciplinary spaces where these kinds of conversations happen, and it just seems rare to me. It seems incredibly rare, and I think that's a yeah. Yeah, and Craig raised a really good question, right? We have collaborated through, or point to us, right? That it's only through the collaboration in our silos that we have able to get through something like environmental humanities. So,
and from reading about your school from the outside, I wonder if one thing that might be helping is the tremendous resources you have for hands-on studying.
yeah.
And because I feel like when I'm trying to get students to think about, so I teach a class on ecological restoration, and how I do the pivot from the biophysical science to starting to think about social science and ethics and philosophy is going out to a stream and saying, all right, what are the things you see here? What are the questions you want to be able to answer? And as people start, like when you're in a place, when you can engage it with something physically, and it sounds like on your campus, there's these tremendous opportunities for hands-on work, right?
Yeah.
You start to see that you can't get by with just the simple questions. Yeah. So I think, or the simple is maybe the wrong word because they're not simple, but so that's not fair. That you can't get away with the one-sided questions, right? That you need to cover the full spectrum of what's happening.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think we do a pretty good job of those kind of experiential things, and we certainly have room to grow, but we're approaching 4:30, and I just want to be mindful of everybody's time, and so this was Rebecca. You've given us a ton to think of. I'm really looking forward to diving into this with my students and rewatching it and thinking about it and reading the book. So we appreciate your time. Thank you. You will be able to talk to a few more students tomorrow, if any of the ones who are here right now on this beautiful day. If you would like to meet with Rebecca tomorrow, send me a message on Canvas, and I will. We're just going to have a kind of like informal coffee hour and kind of chat through some of these research projects and stuff tomorrow morning. So thank you for your time, Craig. It's at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I know there's a conflicting event on campus on a very important issue, which is racial diversity in the Adirondacks. So, no, it's fine. It's all no. It's all good. What I like, we scheduled before they did, and so it's all ours is much smaller anyway, and all of this stuff is recorded, so we can. The beauty of this is the asynchronicity of it, which is a blessing in disguise, I guess. I have learned to embrace that in these COVIDian times. So thank you. I will see you tomorrow. Good luck with your with everybody getting their shots. I found it was the second shot that really packed a punch.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was a great pleasure, and I am really looking forward to talking with folks tomorrow. So
okay.
Yeah.
And yeah. Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah. Thank you too.
All right. See everybody later.
Bye.
So, Joe.